The truth behind this 1890 portrait of two brothers is darker than you imagine. The photograph arrived at the Chicago Historical Museum in a cardboard box filled with estate sale findings from a demolished Victorian home in the Old Town neighborhood. Among the dusty frames, yellowed letters, and tarnished silverware, archivist Michael Torres found a portrait that made him pause. Two young boys, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, stood together in formal clothing against a painted backdrop. The younger boy had his arms wrapped around his older brother in what appeared to be a tender embrace. Michael had cataloged thousands of 19th century photographs during his 12 years at the museum, but something about this image unsettled him. The boys wore matching dark suits with white collars, their hair carefully combed. The older boy stood rigidly, his face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression that seemed forced, almost strained. The younger brother leaned against him, head resting on his shoulder, eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. Another Victorian sibling portrait, Michael muttered, preparing to add it to the general collection. But as he reached for his cataloging sheet, his hand hesitated. He looked at the photograph again, more carefully this time. The lighting was unusual, too perfect, too staged. The older boy's stance was awkward, as if supporting weight rather than simply posing. And the younger boy's complexion, even in the sepia tones, appeared too pale, too waxy. Michael's stomach tightened as realization dawned. He'd read about this practice but had never encountered an example firsthand. Post-mortem photography, the Victorian custom of photographing the deceased, often posed with living family members as a final memorial. He grabbed his magnifying glass and examined the image more closely. The younger boy's hands, visible where they rested against his brother's chest, had a peculiar stillness. No tension in the fingers, no natural curve. The head position, which he'd initially taken for affection, now looked like it had been carefully arranged, perhaps supported by a hidden stand. Most telling was the eyes, not merely closed but sunken slightly, the lids too smooth, lacking the subtle muscle tension of someone simply keeping their eyes shut. "Jesus," Michael whispered. He flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Thomas and William, Chicago, November 1890, Forever Brothers." Below that, in different handwriting, smaller and more recent, "The truth must be known." Michael felt a chill run through him. Someone, perhaps decades ago, had added that second inscription. Someone who knew something about this photograph beyond what the image revealed, something they felt compelled to record. He checked the provenance documents that came with the box. The photograph had been found in a house built in 1889 on Sedgwick Street, owned by a family named Morrison until 1943. After that, the property changed hands several times before being purchased by developers who gutted it last month. Michael spent the rest of the day unable to focus on other work. The photograph sat on his desk, the two boys staring back at him, one frozen in awkward life, the other in eternal stillness. Post-mortem photography had been common in the Victorian era, especially for children who died young. In an age before widespread casual photography, these formal portraits were often the only visual record families had of their loved ones. But something about this particular image felt different. The inscription, "The truth must be known," suggested there was more to the story than a simple memorial photograph. That evening, Michael called his colleague, Dr. Rebecca Foster, a historian specializing in Victorian death customs and mourning practices. Rebecca arrived the next morning, her eyes bright with professional curiosity. "Show me what you found," she said, setting her bag down. Michael handed her the photograph and watched her face as she examined it. Rebecca's expression shifted from interest to recognition to something darker, concern. "This is post-mortem," she confirmed. "But look at the positioning. The older boy isn't just posing with his brother, he's holding him up. See how his arms are locked, how his whole body is braced? And look at his face. Really look at it." Michael leaned in. The older boy's expression, which he'd initially read as strained from holding a pose, now revealed something else. The eyes were red-rimmed, the jaw clenched tight. The boy had been crying, probably for hours or days, and was trying desperately to maintain composure for the camera. "The grief is palpable," Rebecca said softly. "But there's something else. See the bruising on his neck, just above the collar? And here, on his right cheekbone? That shadow isn't from the lighting." Michael felt his pulse quicken. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying we need to find out what happened to these boys," Rebecca interrupted. "Both of them. Because this photograph is documenting more than death. It's documenting something that happened before the death." They turned to the museum's research resources. Chicago death records from 1890 were incomplete but digitized. They searched for William and Morrison in November 1890. Nothing. They tried Thomas Morrison. Still nothing. "The names might not be Morrison," Rebecca suggested. "That was just the family who owned the house later. These could have been previous occupants, or the photograph might have belonged to someone else entirely." Michael remembered the second inscription, "The truth must be known." He examined it under a microscope, noting the ink composition and handwriting style. The letters were shaky but deliberate, written by someone either elderly or emotionally distressed. The ink appeared to be from a fountain pen common in the 1940s or 1950s. "Someone who lived in that house between the 1940s and whenever this was written knew something," Michael said. "They found this photograph and felt compelled to leave a message." Rebecca nodded. "We need to find out who lived in that Sedgwick Street house during that period, and we need to search death records more broadly. Not just Morrison, but any young boys who died in Chicago in November 1890 under circumstances that might explain those marks." The Cook County death records from 1890 filled 3 large ledgers, each page documenting the city's deceased in neat bureaucratic script. Michael and Rebecca sat in the county archives, carefully turning pages, searching for entries that matched their photograph's time frame. November 1890 had been a harsh month in Chicago. An early winter storm had struck in mid-November, bringing freezing temperatures and heavy snow. The death records reflected this: pneumonia, consumption, influenza, exposure. Children's deaths were heartbreakingly common: scarlet fever, diphtheria, accidents. "Here," Rebecca said, her finger stopping on an entry. "William Brennan, age 8, died November 18, 1890. Cause of death listed as accidental fall. Residence, 412 Sedgwick Street." Michael's heart raced. Sedgwick Street, that's the same street as the Morrison house. They requested the full death certificate. While waiting, they continued searching and found another entry. Thomas Brennan, age 10, died November 19, 1890. Same address. Cause of death, trauma from fall. Rebecca looked up, her face pale. Both brothers died within a day of each other, both from falls. That's not a coincidence. The death certificates arrived an hour later. The details were sparse but troubling. William had died on November 18th at approximately 8:20 p.m. The examining physician, Dr. Henry Walsh, noted severe head trauma consistent with fall from height. Thomas died the following evening at 9:30 p.m., with Dr. Walsh recording internal injuries, delayed mortality from fall. But there was another document attached, a brief police report. Officer Patrick Donnelly had been called to 412 Sedgwick Street on November 18th to investigate the death of William Brennan. His notes were terse. Boy found at base of interior stairwell. Father states child fell while playing. Older brother witnessed accident. No evidence of foul play. Accidental death. Older brother witnessed it. Michael read aloud. Thomas saw William fall. Rebecca was already pulling up city directories from 1890. The Brennan family, James Brennan, age 42, occupation listed as foreman at the Union Stockyards. Wife Catherine, age 38. Children, Thomas, William, and a daughter Mary, age 6. The father worked at the stockyards, Rebecca said quietly. Those were brutal places, dangerous, violent. The men who worked there often brought that violence home. Michael understood what she was suggesting, but needed more evidence. We need to find out what happened after the boys died. Where's the family? What happened to Mary, the sister? And who took this photograph? The answer to the last question came from an unexpected source. On the back of the photograph, barely visible under certain light, was a stamp. Sullivan & Sons Photography, State Street. Michael had seen that name before. Sullivan's had been one of Chicago's most prominent photography studios in the 1890s, known particularly for memorial and post-mortem portraits. The Chicago Public Library had a collection of Sullivan's business records, donated by a descendant in the 1970s. Michael and Rebecca spent the next day searching through appointment books and client ledgers. They found the entry in the November 1890 appointment book, Brennan Memorial Sitting, 2 subjects. November 20th, 1890. Special request, post-mortem positioning. The Sullivan & Sons records included more than just appointment logs. The studio's founder, Marcus Sullivan, had been a meticulous record keeper who often made personal notes about significant or unusual commissions. In a leather-bound journal labeled Special Sittings, 1888-1892, Michael and Rebecca found an entry that made their investigation take a darker turn. November 20th, 1890. The Brennan Brothers. A most distressing commission today. Mrs. Catherine Brennan came to the studio with her 2 sons, one living, one deceased. The younger boy, William, had passed 2 days prior. The mother requested a final portrait of the brothers together, as they had been inseparable in life. What troubled me was the condition of the surviving boy, Thomas. He was covered in bruises, some fresh, some older. When I inquired about his injuries, Mrs. Brennan stated he had fallen down the same stairs that killed his brother. But the boy's eyes told a different story. He was terrified, and that terror was not directed at the memory of his brother's death. The father, James Brennan, accompanied them, but remained in the waiting area, drinking from a flask and speaking in a loud, aggressive manner to my assistant. I heard him say that accidents happen to boys who don't mind their fathers. I made the photograph as requested, though it pained me to see young Thomas forced to embrace his dead brother's body. The child wept throughout, though he tried to remain still for the exposure. Mrs. Brennan kept apologizing to me, but I suspected her apologies carried a deeper meaning she could not speak aloud. After they departed, I made a second copy of the negative, something I rarely do without commission. I felt this image might someday need to serve as evidence of something unspeakable. I have placed it in our secure storage with this note. Michael and Rebecca sat in stunned silence. Sullivan's words, written 134 years ago, laid bare what the death certificates and police reports had obscured. This wasn't a tragic accident. William hadn't simply fallen down the stairs. "The father," Rebecca said, her voice tight with anger. "James Brennan killed William, and Thomas witnessed it. That's why he died the next day, from injuries sustained trying to protect his brother, or as punishment for what he saw." Michael nodded, feeling sick, and the police did nothing. One officer came, took the father's word, and closed the case. 2 boys dead within 24 hours, and it was ruled accidental. They needed to find out what happened to the family afterward. Did Catherine Brennan escape with her daughter? Did James Brennan face any consequences? And who had written that second inscription? The truth must be known, on the back of the photograph decades later. The 1900 census records provided the next piece of the puzzle. Catherine Brennan, now listed as a widow, lived at a different address on the north side with her daughter Mary, age 16. James Brennan was not listed as deceased in the cemetery records, suggesting Catherine had simply left him. But there was another entry that caught their attention. Mary Brennan had married in 1898 to a man named Robert Morrison. The Morrison name, the same family who had owned the Sedgwick Street house. Michael traced the Morrison family through property records and city directories. Robert and Mary Morrison had purchased 412 Sedgwick Street in 1912, the same building where Mary's brothers had died 22 years earlier. They lived there for 31 years until Robert's death in 1943, after which Mary remained alone until her own death in 1959. "She went back," Rebecca said, staring at the address. Mary returned to the house where her brothers were killed. The Cook County probate records for Mary Morrison's estate were thin. She'd had no children, and her few possessions had been distributed to distant cousins. But attached to the probate file was an inventory list that included personal photographs and papers. The administrator's notes indicated these items had been left in the house when it was sold. The photograph Michael had found was part of that collection. Mary had kept it for decades, hidden somewhere in that house, carrying the weight of her brother's deaths through her entire adult life. But why had she returned to that address? Why buy the very building where the tragedy occurred? Michael found a partial answer in the Chicago Tribune archives. In March 1901, there was a brief article about a fire on Sedgwick Street that had destroyed number 412. The article mentioned that the building had been vacant for several years and that neighbors suspected arson. No one was injured, and no arrests were made. James Brennan had died 3 months before that fire, in December 1900. His death certificate listed the cause as cirrhosis of the liver, the end stage of chronic alcoholism. He had been living in a rooming house on the west side, alone and destitute. Rebecca pieced it together. Catherine left him sometime between 1890 and 1900. He probably became unemployable, drank himself to death. The house stood empty, and then it burned. Someone wanted to destroy that place. Maybe Catherine, Michael suggested, burning the house where her sons died. Or Mary, Rebecca countered. A teenage girl watching the building that held her worst memories go up in flames. But that still didn't explain why Mary would later purchase the property and rebuild on it. The current structure had been erected in 1911, according to building permits. Robert Morrison, a successful accountant, had commissioned its construction, and he and Mary had moved in as newlyweds the following year. Michael requested Mary Morrison's obituary from 1959. The Chicago Sun-Times had published a short notice. Mary Morrison, 75, died peacefully at her home on Sedgwick Street. A lifelong resident of Chicago, Mrs. Morrison was known for her charitable work with orphaned children and her advocacy for child welfare reforms. She is survived by several cousins. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center. That detail struck Michael hard. Mary had dedicated her adult life to protecting children, working to prevent what had happened to her brothers from happening to others. Michael returned to the photograph, examining every detail with new understanding. The second inscription, "The truth must be known," had been written in the 1940s or 1950s, based on the ink analysis. Mary Morrison had lived alone in that house from 1943 until 1959. She had written those words. But why? And why hide the photograph rather than reveal what had happened? Rebecca had a theory. Victorian families, especially Irish Catholic families like the Brennans, carried enormous shame around domestic violence and family scandal. Even decades later, admitting that your father murdered your brothers would have brought social stigma. Mary couldn't speak the truth openly, but she couldn't let it die with her either. So she wrote a message and hid the photograph, hoping someone would eventually find it and investigate, Michael concluded. They decided to search for any other records Mary might have left. The Chicago Children's Advocacy Center, mentioned in her obituary, had been founded in 1935. Michael called their administrative office and explained his research. The director, a woman named Patricia Henning, was intrigued. "We have a small archive room with materials from our founding. I know Mary Morrison was one of our earliest major donors. Let me see what I can find." 2 days later, Patricia called back. "You need to come see this." The archive room was cramped but well organized. Patricia led them to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Morrison, Mary, Founding Donor. Inside were donation records, correspondence, and a sealed envelope with instructions written on the outside. To be opened only by researchers investigating child welfare history. Patricia looked at Michael and Rebecca. "I think you qualify." Inside the envelope were 3 handwritten pages, dated April 1958. A year before Mary's death. The letter began, "My name is Mary Morrison, born Mary Brennan. I am writing this account because I am 74 years old and in poor health, and I cannot leave this earth without recording the truth of what happened to my brothers, Thomas and William Brennan, in November 1890. Mary's letter described that terrible month in excruciating detail. Their father, James Brennan, had always been violent, but his rages worsened after losing his position as foreman at the stockyards. He drank heavily and blamed their mother for his failures. On November 18, 1890, he came home drunk and furious. William, only 8 years old, had accidentally broken a window while playing. James grabbed the boy and threw him down the interior stairwell. William died almost instantly from head trauma. Thomas, who witnessed everything, attacked his father, trying to protect his younger brother. James beat Thomas savagely, breaking ribs and causing internal injuries. Thomas lingered for another day, dying on November 19th. Their mother, Catherine, called Dr. Walsh, who was sympathetic but unwilling to challenge James's account of two tragic accidents. Mary, then 6 years old, had hidden in a closet during the violence. She heard everything. The police believed my father because he was white, male, and employed. My mother was an immigrant with limited English and no social standing. The system protected him, not us. Thomas and William were buried in separate plots. My father refused to pay for a family grave. My mother had one photograph taken of them together, a final portrait. She kept it hidden for years, terrified my father would destroy it. Mary's letter continued, describing the years that followed her brother's deaths. Catherine Brennan had been trapped, a poor immigrant woman with no education, no family in America, and a young daughter to protect. Leaving James meant poverty and social ostracism, but staying meant risking Mary's life. My mother worked in secret, taking in laundry and sewing, hiding every penny she earned. It took her nearly 7 years to save enough money to leave. In 1897, when I was 13, we fled while my father was at work. We moved to the north side, changed our surname to Casey for several years, and lived in a boarding house for immigrant women. My mother never spoke my brother's names aloud again, but I knew she thought of them every day. She kept the photograph wrapped in cloth, hidden in her trunk. Sometimes I would wake in the night and find her holding it, weeping silently. Catherine found work as a seamstress and eventually opened a small alteration shop. Mary attended school, became a teacher, and met Robert Morrison in 1897. They married a year later. James Brennan never found them. He descended into alcoholism and died alone in 1900. Catherine attended his burial only to ensure he was truly dead. When the old house burned in 1901, my mother and I watched from across the street. I was 17. She held my hand and said, "Now they can rest." I believe she set that fire, though she never admitted it. Catherine died in 1908 at age 56 from pneumonia. Before she died, she gave Mary the photograph of Thomas and William. She made me promise to keep it, to remember them not as broken children, but as the loving brothers they had been. She also made me promise to ensure that what happened to them would not happen to other children, if I could prevent it. Mary honored that promise. She and Robert had wanted children, but were unable to conceive. Instead, Mary devoted her life to child welfare advocacy. She volunteered at orphanages, supported legislation for child protection, and donated generously to organizations serving vulnerable children. When Robert and I decided to build our home, I insisted it be on the site where my brothers died. Robert thought I was mad, but he indulged me. I needed to reclaim that ground, to fill it with love and safety instead of violence and death. I lived in that house for 47 years, and every day I thought of Thomas and William. Every day I worked to make their deaths mean something. The letter's final paragraph explained the photograph's inscription. "I am old now and ill. Soon this house will be sold and the photograph may be found by strangers. I have written, 'The truth must be known' on the back because I cannot die leaving my brother's story erased. Whoever finds this image, please understand. They were children who deserved to live. They were murdered by the man who should have protected them, and the system that should have saved them failed. If telling their story can prevent even one child from suffering as they did, then perhaps their deaths will not have been entirely meaningless." Michael and Rebecca spent the following weeks researching child protection systems, or the lack thereof, in 1890s Chicago. What they discovered was a landscape of systematic neglect that had allowed tragedies like the Brennan brothers' deaths to occur with frightening regularity. The Illinois Juvenile Court Act, which established the first juvenile court system in the United States and included provisions for child protection, wasn't enacted until 1899, 9 years too late for Thomas and William. Before that, police and courts generally treated domestic violence as a private family matter, intervening only in the most extreme circumstances. Rebecca found records from the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, a charitable organization that occasionally investigated reports of child abuse. Their files from 1890 documented dozens of suspicious child deaths ruled as accidents or natural causes, with minimal investigation. The Society's workers, overwhelmed and underfunded, could do little more than note their concerns. Dr. Walsh, the physician who examined both Brennan boys, appeared in multiple case files. He'd reported his suspicions about several child deaths to the police, but his concerns were routinely dismissed. In 1893, Walsh testified before a city council committee, advocating for mandatory reporting laws and better investigation protocols. His testimony was recorded in city records. "I have examined the bodies of too many children whose deaths were attributed to clumsiness, illness, or accident, when the evidence clearly suggested otherwise. Until we treat children as citizens deserving of protection rather than as property of their parents, these tragedies will continue." Walsh's advocacy contributed to gradual reforms, but change came slowly. The Illinois child labor laws of 1893 provided some protections for working children, and the 1899 Juvenile Court Act finally established a legal framework for intervention in cases of abuse and neglect. Michael found evidence that Mary Morrison had been directly involved in these later reforms. Her name appeared on petition lists supporting child welfare legislation in 1935, 1947, and 1952. She had testified before the Illinois State Legislature in 1950, advocating for increased funding for child protective services, though she never publicly mentioned her brother's deaths. The Chicago Children's Advocacy Center's records showed that Mary's donations had helped establish one of the first specialized interview rooms for child abuse victims in the country, designed to be less traumatic than police stations or courtrooms. The center's 1959 annual report, published shortly after her death, included a tribute. Mary Morrison believed that every child deserved to be heard, protected, and valued. Her generosity has made that belief a reality for countless children. Rebecca traced the photograph's journey through the decades. After Mary's death in 1959, the house was sold to a couple who lived there until 1978. They likely never discovered the photograph, hidden in a wall cavity that Mary had created. Subsequent owners similarly missed it. Only when developers began demolition in 2024 did a worker find the photograph, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked behind the original plaster in what had been Mary's bedroom. Michael and Rebecca prepared a comprehensive exhibition for the Chicago Historical Museum titled Unseen Witnesses: Child Victims and Advocates in Victorian Chicago. The centerpiece was the photograph of Thomas and William Brennan, displayed alongside Mary's letter, Marcus Sullivan's journal entry, Dr. Walsh's testimony, and documentation of the child welfare reforms their deaths had eventually helped inspire. The exhibition opened on November 18, 2024, exactly 134 years after William Brennan's death. Michael had insisted on that date, feeling it was important to mark the anniversary, to publicly acknowledge what had happened on that day in 1890. The response was overwhelming. Local news stations covered the story. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page feature titled "Two Brothers, One Photograph, and the Long Road to Child Protection." Advocacy organizations, historians, social workers, educators, and community members visited the exhibition in steady streams. What struck Michael most were the visitors who stood silently before the photograph, some weeping openly. Many were survivors of child abuse who saw their own experiences reflected in the story. Others were social workers, foster parents, or child advocates who understood how hard-won the protections children now enjoyed had been. One visitor, a woman named Jennifer Collins, approached Michael during the exhibition's second week. She introduced herself as a genealogist who had been researching her family history. "I'm descended from Catherine Brennan's sister," Jennifer explained. "My great-great-grandmother emigrated from Ireland in 1895 and settled in Boston. We knew Catherine had lost children in Chicago, but the family story was always that they died in an accident, a house fire or something. No one ever mentioned that they were murdered." Jennifer had brought documents of her own, letters between Catherine and her sister, written in the late 1890s. With Jennifer's permission, Michael added these to the exhibition. In one letter dated 1898, Catherine wrote, "I wake every morning and remember that Thomas and William are not here. I remember their voices, their laughter, the way William would climb into Thomas's bed during thunderstorms. I remember Thomas trying to be brave, trying to protect his little brother even when he was terrified himself. I remember failing them, but I also remember that Mary is alive, that she is safe, that she will grow up knowing she is loved and valued, that she will never fear her own father. If I could not save my sons, at least I saved my daughter. It is not enough. It will never be enough, but it is something. The exhibition also featured information about modern child protection systems, showing visitors how the laws and institutions that now protect children evolved from the failures that cost Thomas and William their lives. Child abuse hotlines, mandatory reporting requirements, specialized investigative units, family courts. None of these existed in 1890. Rebecca organized a panel discussion featuring child welfare experts, historians, and advocates. They discussed how far child protection had come and how far it still needed to go. Statistics showed that even now, with all the legal frameworks and support systems, children still fell through the cracks, still suffered in silence, still died from abuse and neglect. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Michael stood in the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center's new wing, attending a dedication ceremony. The organization had used the attention from the Brennan brothers' story to launch a major fundraising campaign, raising money for expanded services and a new facility. The wing was being named the Thomas and William Brennan Center for Child Safety. A plaque beside the entrance featured the photograph of the two brothers, along with an explanation of their story and Mary Morrison's lifelong advocacy work. These two boys died in 1890 because the systems that should have protected them didn't exist, the center's director, Patricia Henning, said during her speech. Their sister Mary spent her life ensuring that such systems would exist for future generations. Today, we honor all three of them by continuing that work. Michael had donated his researcher's fee from several publications about the Brennan case to the center. Rebecca had done the same. The story had generated significant media attention, leading to speaking engagements, journal articles, and even interest from documentary filmmakers. But what mattered most to Michael was simpler and more personal. He thought about Marcus Sullivan, the photographer who had made an extra copy of the negative because he knew the truth needed to be preserved. He thought about Dr. Walsh, who kept speaking up despite being ignored. He thought about Catherine Brennan, who saved her pennies for 7 years to escape, who burned the house where her sons died, who gave her daughter the tools to create change. And he thought about Mary Morrison, who bought the land where her brothers were murdered and built a home filled with love on ground that had known only violence, who couldn't speak their names aloud but worked every day to prevent other children from suffering as they had suffered. The photograph had survived 134 years, hidden in walls, passed through unknowing hands, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what it really showed. Not just two brothers in an embrace, one living, one dead, but evidence of a crime, a family's trauma, and a society's failure. Michael had arranged for high-quality reproductions of the photograph to be made available to researchers, educators, and advocates. He'd worked with the museum to create educational materials for schools, helping teachers discuss difficult topics like domestic violence and child protection in age-appropriate ways. Jennifer Collins, the distant relative, had connected with other descendants of the Brennan family scattered across the country. They were planning a memorial service for Thomas and William, finally acknowledging them not as shameful secrets, but as victims who deserve to be remembered and honored. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, November 19, 2024, a small group gathered at the graves of the two brothers. Their headstones, simple and separate, bore only their names and dates. Jennifer had arranged for new markers to be placed, inscribed with a quote from Mary's letter. They were children who deserved to live. Michael stood in the cold cemetery, watching as Jennifer placed flowers on each grave. Rebecca was there too, along with Patricia from the Advocacy Center and several staff members who had worked on the exhibition. They stood together in silence, bearing witness to two lives that had been cut short, two boys who had loved each other and died trying to protect each other. As they prepared to leave, Michael looked back at the graves one final time. The photograph had told its story. The truth, hidden for 134 years, was finally known. Thomas and William Brennan were no longer just anonymous faces in a disturbing Victorian portrait. They were children with names, with a history, with a sister who loved them enough to spend her entire life honoring their memory by protecting others. Their photograph would remain on display at the museum, a stark reminder of how far society had come and how much work remained. Every visitor who paused before that image, who learned their story, who understood what that embrace really meant, each one was a small victory against the forgetting, against the silence that had protected their killer and erased their suffering. Mary Morrison's final wish had been granted. The truth was known. And in knowing it, perhaps other children would be saved, other families spared, other brothers allowed to grow old together instead of being frozen forever in a photographer's studio. One alive and one dead, united only in their shared tragedy. Michael walked away from the cemetery knowing that this was why he did this work. Not just to catalog artifacts and preserve history, but to give voice to the silenced, to seek truth in the shadows, and to ensure that even those who died forgotten would ultimately be remembered. The photograph had kept its secret for 134 years. Now it would keep their memory forever.